every dollar with Medicaid planning. So thank you for registering and attending today's webinar. As always, you can kind of see a full list of our events and upcoming webinars on our website. Our material today is actually going to be a book, our book all about nursing homes and long-term care planning. That'll be sent out to those who registered and attended. There will be some email information provided to you after today's webinar. There's a spot to give feedback, ask if there are any specific topics or events that you'd like to do. But we are going to have a live question and answer feature today as we talk about some of that Medicaid planning. So you by no means have to save your questions for the end. If you have anything, you can put them right in chat if you feel comfortable sharing. I do understand that sometimes there are some questions or things that you'd like to discuss that are maybe harder to ask in a question and answer feature, or you may need more specific review of documents and answers. So please just know that we do always offer a 2-hour complimentary initial consultation where you can sign up for us to call you to schedule that with that same feedback form. So if there are any good questions or things that you might need in the future, just know that we do offer 2-hour complimentary initial consultations, and you can always ask questions today. So starting firstly then with kind of more like what is Medicaid, which is our topic for today. I think a lot of people get confused between Medicare and Medicaid, and rightly so. Those are really similar words. Essentially, when it was created as federal law in the 60s, they just kind of decided, okay, Medicare pays for this and Medicaid pays for that. There's no more, kind of stricter definition of the two other than that's just how the law was created. So Medicaid is a federal benefit that's administered by each state. So states can't be more restrictive than Medicaid. They can be less restrictive. So just know that when you look at Medicaid as an option for paying for care, there are lots of things that you can see online. They're not always good advice, so always make sure that you consult with an attorney, and do know that it can vary a little bit from state to state. So you do want to always try to get Wisconsin-specific information. But Medicaid is really the benefit that can help to pay for someone's long-term care. So if someone needs to receive long-term care in a skilled nursing facility, assisted living, or even at home through waiver programs such as IRIS and community cares, family care, there are options to be able to pay for that long-term care. But Medicare does not pay for long-term care. Medicare will cover hospital stays or rehabilitative stays for up to 100 days, and they don't pay for the entire 100 days, and they don't pay the full amount. They pay certain percentages and certain amounts, but ultimately, if someone needs to be in a nursing home and they're not going to get better, that they're not going to return home, or they're likely to be in need of those care services for longer than however much time, then you're going to be looking at Medicaid as the primary payer. So Medicaid can be a fairly restrictive program in terms of, when do you actually qualify for Medicaid? Because you can't just move into a nursing home and then just have Medicaid start to pay. You have to meet certain income and asset and functional requirements. So really with Medicaid, it's kind of 3 things that you're looking for if you actually wanted to be on Medicaid. The first thing is that you have to actually be in need of those long-term care services. So if someone is receiving that long-term care at home or like in a skilled nursing, that's pretty common that they're going to meet those functional requirements. It's just that that's part of the law because they didn't want people moving into nursing homes if they didn't need care, which always just kind of makes me laugh because it's a little ridiculous to think that anyone would want to go into a nursing home if they didn't need to be there. I haven't had any clients wanting really to go into a nursing home, but that's okay. That's one requirement. Medicaid also has income and asset requirements. So their income and asset requirements to be on Medicaid is going to be different if you're a married person or a married couple versus a single person. So when it comes to income, it's pretty easy to understand for spouses, what Medicaid says for spouses is that there's a community spouse and an institutionalized spouse. And I know that word institutionalized can be a little bit dated. That's just what they call it. You have the community spouse, the institutionalized spouse. So the community spouse can keep all of their income. So if the community spouse or the person at home has $10,000 a month in their income, then that's great. They can keep all of it, but they can keep at least a certain amount of income. So there can be like an income shift between spouses. So if the spouse who is at home has less than, I think, about $2,600 a month in income, they can shift over some income from the spouse receiving care to get to them up to about that maximum benefit. But if they have more than that amount of income, then there's no shift. They just get to keep everything that they have. So sometimes for spouses understanding, well, how much income would I have? How is that going to change? Because if you're used to having together, $6,000 a month, $8,000 a month in income, there can be an idea of that community spouse having a lot less in income than they're used to. But there can be a way to shift some of the income from the spouse receiving care over to the spouse at home. For a single person, that income calculation is a lot easier because Medicaid as a concept is kind of like a cost equalizer program. So if a person is in a nursing home or assisted living, and that assisted living normally costs them $6,000 a month, and they have, $3,000 a month from their pension and Social Security, then what Medicaid is going to do is it's going to take their $3,000 a month in income. It's going to give them $45 a month for their personal needs. And then Medicaid is going to pay the difference between whatever that cost of the facility is and whatever that person has in income. So for a single person on Medicaid, that means all of their income, or if they're that institutionalized spouse, all of the rest of that income is going to the state as part of what's called their cost of care share. And they only get $45 a month from their income for their personal needs. And if that $45 feels really low, that is because it is. That $45 has been the same when that law was originally written in the 60s. It doesn't go up for inflation. It's still just $45 a month of the income for someone's personal needs. So you can see that there are big differences between being a married couple and a single individual with income, and there are still asset requirements. So what Medicaid would say about someone's assets is you may potentially have too much in assets for Medicaid to still pay, even if you run at a shortfall with your care, meaning that your income alone is not enough to cover those care costs. So for a married couple, how Medicaid would look at assets is they'd say that, well, you can have a home. It's a non-countable asset. And if there's a spouse living at home, then we don't have to necessarily be worried about a lien placed if the institutionalized spouse passes. So the home is non-countable. You can also have some money set aside for burial for each spouse and other family members. So we normally say about $15,000 per spouse for their burial arrangements. They can have one vehicle. That's not one vehicle per spouse. That's one vehicle in total is non-countable. You can have less than $1,500 face value life insurance, or the cash value is countable. And then all the retirement accounts or qualified accounts of the community spouse. So if the community spouse has $1 million in their IRA, that's all non-countable. But it kind of just depends on what spouse needs care and who had the larger retirement assets. Because a lot of times we do see in older couples a little bit more of an unevenness in retirement assets, like the husband having a lot in his IRA or 401k or even his pension, and then the wife maybe having minimal retirement assets, if no retirement assets. And then oftentimes those husbands do tend to need care first. Women tend to need care for longer, so you don't really get a break there either way. But it just really depends as to the shift between assets, if someone has retirement assets or how those are split between the couple. And then there's a certain amount of countable assets that the spouse gets to keep. So all of those items that I just mentioned are non-countable. Everything else then is countable. So any secondary residences, any life insurance over that value, bank accounts, investment accounts, retirement assets of the community or the institutionalized spouse, those all count. And then basically it's just like a calculation that Medicaid uses. So of the countable assets, the community spouse gets to keep at least 50,000. So if they add all those things up and everything countable is under 50,000, that's just all going to the community spouse. They get to keep everything. And then what they basically say for the countable assets is that you can have up to I think it's about $155,000 this year. So $155,000 of the countable assets, and that is going to go up each year with inflation. So they don't let you keep all of that though. What they kind of do is they add up the countable assets and they say, okay, the most that your half can be is 155,000. So if someone has $400,000 in countable assets, they're still going to have to spend the countable assets below 155,000. If you had, 100,000 in countable assets, well, then they take the 100,000, and then kind of divide it in half, and you get to still keep above the 50,000. So it can be confusing. It can definitely be confusing. But it's kind of like there are certain non-countable things. There are countable things, and then for spouses, it's a calculation as to how much the community spouse is able to keep and how much would have to be spent down. For single individuals, it's certainly a lot easier, unfortunately, I guess you'd say, that single person can still have a home, but we are now more concerned about that lien, and we'll talk about estate recovery. They can still have that money for burial, one vehicle. They can still have that very low amount of life insurance, that $1,500 face value. So 1,500 face value, otherwise the cash value is countable. And then all of their countable assets have to be below $2,000. So for a single person, there's much more spend down that would have to happen in order for them to actually qualify for Medicaid. Which brings me to our exact topic for today. All of those things were explanations on what Medicaid is. Now we're going to talk about how to stretch those dollars, right? Because those values can be really low. And the problem is that while Medicaid is great in what it does pay for, sometimes it's also difficult because of what it doesn't pay for. So Medicaid is the primary payer when someone is actually eligible for Medicaid. So they pick up that cost of the facility and those other medical expenses. But Medicaid is paying for those necessities. So they're not going to pay for if someone needs, they like cable, they like Netflix, they like going out to eat, they like getting their hair cut, as that single person, you're only going to have $2,000 really in your bank. And you're going to have $45 a month of your income for your personal needs. So, $45 a month, to be frank, doesn't even really pay for my haircut. So it can be really, really hard to live on that amount of money. So what can be done in order to help stretch out certain assets is that you're trying to maybe set things aside so that way they don't count against you for Medicaid. They're non-recoverable for Medicaid. But there's still potential monies to be able to be tapped into if you're on Medicaid and it's still not paying for everything that you might need, really those quality of life items. There's also ideas with Medicaid about private pay requirements. So in general, when you're looking at long-term care facilities, not all facilities even take Medicaid because Medicaid is going to pay less than private pay individuals do. And in order to be responsible businesses, facilities have to know, well, for this many people on Medicaid, we have this many people privately paying because the Medicaid people with the kind of state group bulk rate that they get, they pay less than private pay people do. So often you'll hear a term about number of Medicaid beds, or, you'll hear we have private pay requirements, or we just don't take Medicaid. So you need to know if you're looking at Medicaid as the payer, well, does that facility take Medicaid? What is that monthly or daily cost? And then how long do I have to pay? Because when when facilities are kind of figuring out who to take on Medicaid and how that's going to work, they often have private pay requirements. So if they take Medicaid at all, they typically say yes, but you have to pay a year or 2 years, most common in our area, or 3 years first before you would be able to go on Medicaid and stay here. So lots of facilities, if you're open with like how much you have in assets, they're willing to work with people. But if you want control in terms of the quality of care that you receive, it's just important to maybe plan as to how to meet those private pay requirements in the meantime, and then maybe go on Medicaid. Or what to do if you privately paid at a facility and now that facility, it closes or it decides to stop accepting Medicaid. Then you have whole new private pay requirements that you have to worry about. Or that facility is fine, but all of a sudden they get bought out by someone and the care is not what it was. Would I like to move? Or what if I need to move locations? Unfortunately, with Medicaid, if people just spend and spend and spend and spend until the point that they meet those asset requirements that we talked about, that can still leave them in a position of not having enough money. And then something else happens that they need to plan for. And what do you do at that point? So a lot of times with Medicaid, people talk about gifting. And gifting can be a strategy to help with long-term care planning, but it's often not the best strategy for long-term care planning because there are certain tax things that we need to be aware of with gifting and with how Medicaid works as a program. Because what Medicaid says is, well, you can't just give away everything that you have overnight and expect us to pay for your care. So what people are trying to do is they're trying to give assets, say, to their kids or other people, so that way there's money outside of what's considered countable or available for care, and then can be used once they're on Medicaid. So people are trying to do gifting 5 years in advance of needing Medicaid. The reason is because Medicaid has a 5-year look back. So like I said, you can't just give everything away overnight and then expect Medicaid to pay for your care, because they're probably going to award a penalty. And what a penalty or gift or divestment really is not Medicaid coming and taking what you gifted back. They say, okay, well, based on how much you gave away in the 5 years before you needed care, this is how long we won't pay for. So right now that this year, it's just about $9,600 is 1 month of care that Medicaid won't pay for. So the real problem with gifting is people sometimes unintentionally gift or create problems with Medicaid, and then you can't toll that penalty with Medicaid until you're actually eligible, which means that you're out of money and now Medicaid still won't pay for whatever amount of time they won't pay for. So if you gave away, easy math, $96,000 and whatever it is, 5 years before you needed to apply for Medicaid, that's 10 months Medicaid won't pay. So your family may not have the ability to pay back some of those assets or have other ways to pay through for care in the meantime, and then your quality of care is at risk, or you're at risk of being evicted from that facility because no one's paying. So you want to be really careful with gifting, and especially with gifting, we often want to look at actually doing irrevocable trust-based planning, either at the outset, like prospective planning or emergency planning. So what that often means with long-term care planning and trying to stretch what you have is we're not trying to hide everything away so that way you never pay anything for your care. We want to make sure that there's that idea of that pot of money that could be used to supplement Medicaid and is still protected from estate recovery. Because in Wisconsin, we're an expanded estate recovery state. So those revocable trusts after August 1st, 2014 are not protected from that estate recovery. And life estates are also not protected from estate recovery now if they're done after August 1st of 2014. So there are some changes to the law there if you had prior planning. But really what that means is that in order to protect things from that recovery, you may want to look at doing an irrevocable trust. And transferring assets to irrevocable trust rather than to your kids directly is a lot safer for you, or if you're that child, for your parent. Because with the irrevocable trust, what we're trying to do is always make sure that, there's still some control over things as best as you can, but we're not creating any liability or tax problems there either. So I'll give you just a real concrete example. The home is a non-countable asset for Medicaid, right? Non-countable. However, especially for that single person, we are worried about liens. So liens can be placed against whatever someone had in that non-countable or even potentially countable column once they pass away and access Medicaid benefits. So that single person can have the home, but it is something that lien can be placed on that. So sometimes people are really trying to protect their home or certain assets, and they give those assets from themselves to their children. And that home is a prime example of why oftentimes gifting for Medicaid is not a good idea. Because there's really three problems that transfer creates. First of all, it's a huge loss of control. There is nothing that's a greater loss of control for you than taking something that you own and giving it to someone else. Because now, without anything else in writing, while it would be ethically awful for those children who receive that house to start charging that parent rent or evict that parent or sell that home and keep that money, without anything else in writing, they can do those things because they own it now. We're also trying to protect against the very limited liability of you needing Medicaid. Some people never end up needing long-term care, and I'm not clairvoyant, neither are you. But we're trying to protect against that one liability. So if you gift your home to your kids, and let's say you have multiple kids, now we just have more risk of liability for those people, because whatever happens to the owner of a property happens to that property. So if now one of those children need long-term care, which it can happen at any age, what if they need Medicaid or their spouse needs Medicaid? What if they're getting divorced or sued or need to file for bankruptcy or they pass away? Any of those things now happen to your home because they own it. It's also just bad for taxes. It's also just bad to gift that real property to kids for tax purposes, because there are a lot of, I'll call it like tax positive things that happen with real estate related to when you pass or if you sold your primary residence. So when it comes to someone's primary home, you don't typically have to worry about paying capital gains when you sell it, because there's something called a 121 exclusion. So most people, when they sell their primary residence, they get like this coupon from the IRS for up to $250,000 of capital gains tax forgiveness. You get that because it's your primary residence. If you transfer it to the kids, their cost basis is now just like whatever you bought it for, and they're not going to get that same coupon if it's not their primary residence. The best way for your kids to actually receive property is to receive it once you pass away, because then the IRS revalues whatever the home is worth to whatever it's worth when you died, not whatever you bought it for. So the better way for the kids to receive it, if they're going to sell it or just in general, is to receive it as part of that inheritance. And when you transfer it during your lifetime, you lose out on that. So irrevocable trust-based planning is kind of like where we're trying to set aside that money. We're just doing it in a trust. So that way, mom and dad could potentially hire or fire some of those trustees so they can still make the kids the trustees. But now we're not worried about those liabilities because the trustee is like a manager, not an owner. So we're less concerned about liabilities, and we can maintain those tax benefits by still having it be yours for tax purposes, because the IRS and Medicaid play by different rules. Oh, which is another point I forgot to touch on. That $18,000 per person per tax year, or whatever that amount is that you can gift tax-free, that's the IRS rules related to gift tax returns. It has nothing at all to do with Medicaid. Medicaid and the IRS play by different rules. Sometimes that's to our advantage, sometimes to our disadvantage, but there is no safe harbor for that gifting for Medicaid. That's another point people really confuse. So yes, a lot of times with Medicaid and long-term care planning, we are trying to stretch those dollars so that way, that spend down is less, or there is still money left if you had spent down. We're trying to control that quality of care for as long as possible and really stretch it. It's sometimes a lot better to do irrevocable trust-based planning than gift planning. So there are always options that you have. The most important thing is to be able to talk with an attorney and figure out what's going to be best. And also whether it's prospective planning or emergency planning. making sure that you have good powers of attorney in place, because all of these options that you have, if you can't personally do that, you may need your financial power of attorney to do that for you. And your power of attorney can only do whatever that document says. So it's always a really good idea to have any current planning that you have reviewed by especially an elder law attorney if you have questions on long-term care planning, because those powers of attorney aren't the same thing. There's no like universal concept for what a financial power of attorney can do. There are state statutes that help define that, but you may often want to grant more authorities than what the statutes do, or especially what that state power of attorney form does. So know that that's really important to allow you to be able to do long-term care planning now, or maybe in the future if you're not able to do that for yourself. I know I covered a lot, hopefully not too fast, try to parcel it out, but we could talk for hours about long-term care planning and what options are best. I just wanted to kind of, what is Medicaid? How does it work? What are we trying to spend down to? Why are we trying to do that? What might be some of the hurdles in planning that you need to be aware of for facilities? And then how do we accomplish that? We typically want to do that with an irrevocable trust rather than outright gifting, but it kind of depends on someone's circumstances, and especially those taxes. Those are good things we're wanting to be aware of. So, okay, I haven't seen any questions, and that's okay. If you have any questions, just know that, we do have those initial consultations that we offer. Otherwise, next week, we're going to be talking about, at our webinar, Probate 101. So what is it and should you use it? So if you have questions on probate, that's a good webinar to attend. Otherwise, May 1st, we'll be having a Your Care, Your Way long-term care. So all of those events are published on our website, where you can see a full list of our events, what's upcoming, be able to register for those events. You can also always go to estateplannинglive.com to see that full list of events, register anything that looks interesting to you. Otherwise, I'll let you go. Get back to your rainy afternoon here. At least it's rainy in Appleton. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Have a good rest of your day.